Good morning and welcome to the Maryland Public Services Commission's meeting for June 3rd, 2020. We'll begin the day by coming to order and approval of the minutes, the draft minutes from the May 27th, 2020 meeting, taking the vote, beginning with Commissioner Richard.
I vote aye.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Aye.
Commissioner Linton.
Aye.
And Commissioner Herman.
Aye.
I vote aye. The draft meeting minutes are approved. Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, there are two items on today's consent agenda. Item number one is the application of Evolve Energy Holdings LLC for a license to supply electricity or electric generation services for the state of Maryland. And item number two is the request of Titan Gas LLC to add an additional trade name to its existing gas and electric supplier licenses.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Do the commissioners have any questions of these two consent items? Hearing none, I would move that with respect to item number one, we grant the company a license to operate as an electricity supplier in Maryland, limited to broker services and aggregator services for the customer classes and service territories applied for and recommended by staff. That we direct the company to provide marketing and training materials specific to its Maryland operations to commission staff 30 days prior to utilization of the materials in Maryland, and that we direct the company to file notice with the commission within 30 days of any changes to the information in its application. With respect to item number two, I propose that we note the trade name. The vote begins with Commissioner Richard.
I vote aye.
O'Donnell.
Aye.
Commissioner Linton.
Aye.
And Commissioner Herman.
Aye.
Thank you. I vote aye. The two consent items are approved. Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, item number three on today's administrative agenda is an application from the District of Columbia Water and Sewer for certification as a renewable energy facility for the company's DC Water Blue Plains wastewater treatment plant. In this item for staff, we have Kevin Mosier and Kenneth Albert. And for the company, Saul Pinter, Christopher Piat, and Gregory Hope.
Thank you. And as a general reminder, if everybody could turn their microphones off until you are prepared to talk, that will cut down on a lot of the static and the background noise. With respect to item number three, we're going to begin with comments by the commission staff.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, commissioners. This is Kenneth Albert on behalf of staff. Sometimes a party asks this commission for authorization to do something that does have important benefits, public benefits. And however, if that proposed action violates the requirements of the Public Utilities Article, the PUA, the commission has no choice in this situation but to reject the request, even though that may be a difficult choice given the public benefits. And unfortunately, that's precisely the situation we have here in connection with the filing by the District of Columbia Water and Sewer Authority, I'll call them DC Water for short, where they're asking the commission to certify as a renewable energy facility the Blue Plains wastewater treatment plant in connection with the thermal energy in the form of steam that is a byproduct of burning the biogas, that is essentially methane, that is produced by the plant when the plant processes the wastewater. The biogas is burned in the plant's turbines to generate electricity to power the plant's operations. Significant here is that in burning the biogas, the turbines, as all gas turbines do, they create a substantial amount of heat, referred to as waste heat. It's often vented into the atmosphere, but here DC Water wants to utilize that waste heat to produce steam to facilitate the chemical process that produces the biogas. So this enhances both the cost efficiency of the process. In 2017, the commission certified DC Water's wastewater treatment plant as a renewable energy facility, but only in connection with the electricity generated by the plant in burning the biogas. Certification as a renewable energy facility allowed DC Water to receive renewable energy credits, referred to as RECs, in connection with the electricity generated by the plant. In its new application here, DC Water seeks certification of Blue Plains as a renewable energy facility and connected with the thermal energy in the form of steam that is produced by the facility and is used as part of the process of producing the biogas. DC Water asserts that the thermal energy created by the plant constitutes a Tier 1 renewable resource under Section 7-701R of the Public Utilities Article. And this would mean that the thermal energy would be eligible for RECs. under PUA 7-701R4, quote, methane from the anaerobic decomposition of organic materials in a landfill or a wastewater treatment plant constitutes a type 1 renewable resource. As explained in staff's comments, the legislative intent of the REC law and the legislative findings that underlie the REC law, as stated in PUA 7-702, coupled with the plain meaning of the REC law, indicate that a Tier 1 renewable resource REC applies only to electricity generated by a renewable energy facility through the use of a renewable source, with the exception of a limited class of renewable sources for which the legislature specifically created an exemption that establishes that non-electric energy, including the thermal energy here, produced from these renewable sources qualifies for RECs. Under 7-702A, there we have an express statement of the intent of the law, and as we note in our comments, the General Assembly refers to its intent to, quote, establish a market for electricity from these sources in Maryland, end quote, and to, quote, lower the cost to consumers of electricity produced from these sources, end quote, we believe that makes it clear that RECs are only intended for electricity generated from eligible renewable resources. As explained in page 2 of staff's comments, the General Assembly's findings that underlie the REC law in PUA 7-702B that also highlight that RECs are for electricity generation. However, we do recognize that there are several amendments to the PUA that allow RECs for thermal energy from a short list of specified renewable resources. For example, in 2012, the General Assembly enacted a law that states that thermal energy from several agricultural operations that are specified in the law, including incinerating poultry waste, qualify as a Tier 1 energy resource. In 2012, the General Assembly enacted another law that states that thermal energy from a geothermal system qualifies for RECs. And in 2011, the General Assembly enacted a law that grants solar RECs in connection with in connection with a solar hot water heater. But significant here is that the General Assembly has not enacted a law to create an exemption to grant RECs for thermal energy produced by a wastewater treatment plant, which is the situation here. This absence of an exemption for thermal energy in connection with wastewater treatment is also reflected in the fact that PUA 7-704 addresses the calculation of RECs for the thermal energy measured in British thermal units, BTUs, associated with the solar water heating system, under PUA 7-704G, geothermal heating and cooling system under 7-704H, and a thermal biomass system under PUA 7-704I. But PUA 7-704 does not address the calculation of RECs for thermal energy associated with wastewater treatment. We believe this is another indication that RECs are not available for thermal energy associated with wastewater treatment. This view that the only thermal energy eligible for RECs is associated with resources other than wastewater treatment, such as animal waste, geothermal resources, and solar energy for hot water, is supported by a report that was issued by the Maryland Thermal Renewable Energy Task Force in 2014, entitled Report of the Thermal Energy Task Force. The 2013 law established the task force to, quote, analyze how to restructure the renewable portfolio standard under Title 7, Subtitle 7 of the Public Utilities article to incorporate thermal energy resources, including energy derived from wood-derived biomass. The task force members included a member of the commission staff, as well as the member of the Maryland House and the Maryland Senate, along with the director of the Maryland Energy Administration and the secretaries of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, the Department of the Environment, and the Department of Agriculture. What is significant here is that this report, again, January 2014, recognized that the only thermal energy eligible for RECs is associated with animal waste, geothermal, and solar hot water heaters. And I'll quote, the task force, this is a quote directly from the report on page 9, the task force focused considerable attention on determining the best method to increase thermal energy in the RPS, that is the Renewable Portfolio Standard. The majority of this debate centered on whether it was more appropriate to incorporate thermal energy into the existing Tier 1 or to create a separate thermal tier structure. Currently, solar hot water heating systems can receive solar tier RECs for thermal energy, while geothermal heating and cooling systems and animal manure-based biomass systems, which can be co-fired with woody biomass, can receive tier 1 RECs for thermal energies. These systems are incorporated directly into the RPS with systems that generate electricity. End of quote. Thus, the fact that the task force report noted that thermal RECs are available for geothermal, animal waste, and solar hot water heaters is additional evidence that thermal energy from wastewater treatment is not eligible for RECs, because again, it's not mentioned anywhere. Now, DC Water does make the point that using the steam from the turbines to facilitate the production of biogas reduces the need for DC Water to rely on burning gas to generate the steam needed as part of the biogas production. And they point out that this enhances the energy and cost efficiency of the plant. We totally agree with that. Again, as we started our presentation, we appreciate the environmental and cost efficiencies associated with using the waste heat to generate, as part of the process to generate the steam. But again, our question we have here is whether the legislature contemplated that wastewater treatment, thermal energy associated with a wastewater treatment plant is eligible for RECs. And again, as we've shown, both the statute makes it abundantly clear, especially in conjunction with the task force report, that thermal energy from a wastewater treatment plant is not eligible for RECs.
Thank you, Mr. Albert. At this time, we'll turn to counsel for DC Water, and you'll have an opportunity to explain why staff's position is either incorrect or not on point. If you could begin by stating your name.
Good morning. My name is Gregory Hope. Good morning, Commissioners Stanek, Richard, O'Donnell, Linton, and Herman, and Commissioner staff. Thank you for the opportunity for DC Water to discuss our application to certify the Bailey Bioenergy Facility as a renewable energy facility for Maryland Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard for its use of methane as a Tier 1 renewable energy source, produce heat thermal energy. It is not a byproduct of the system, as the staff had commented in their comments, but one of the primary products produced by the facility using methane biogas. We have submitted detailed written comments in support of our application, and our presentation today will outline those points. With me today are my DC Water colleagues, Christopher Piat, Director of Resources Recovery, and Saul Kinter, Energy Initiative Program Manager, who will discuss the Bailey Bioenergy System, its purpose and function, and from an engineering perspective, how it should be treated under the RPS. My presentation, which will come after, which will focus on the RPS statutory and regulatory schemes that supports our application, if that's acceptable.
Yes, Mr. Hope, that is.
And I'm not sure which one Saul or Mr. will be speaking.
Yeah, I would. This is Chris Piat. I'm the Director of Resource Recovery at DC Water. I just want to do a short introduction and then probably hand it back over to Gregory for the legal argument. And Saul prepared the comments, and he is very familiar with the technical aspects of this as well. Maybe this is obvious, but DC Water is a not-for-profit authority that provides drinking water and wastewater treatment processes for DC and also 2 counties in Maryland. 42% of our flow comes from Maryland. And if you split that flow out, it would be one of the largest treatment plants in Maryland as well. So we have a responsibility to the ratepayers of DC and Maryland to maximize the assets that we have. That's sort of what my group does. I'm the Director of Resource Recovery, and we are supposed to look at all of the potential assets that we have, maximize them for the ratepayers. So what we're asking, it's been laid out very clearly, and we really appreciate the thorough comments of the staff, thorough and well thought out comments. But we'd really like the PSC to consider our application for these Tier 1 RECs for heat from the CHP system. As was mentioned already, we are already recognized for our electricity that is generated from our CHP system, but we deliberately chose turbines so that we would generate enough heat energy or in order to heat up our digesters and our pre-digestion system, thermal hydrolysis. Digestion is, of course, a biological process. Thermal hydrolysis is a pre-digestion process that heats up, uses high heat and high pressure, heats up the solids for two purposes. One, to eliminate the pathogens so that we have a saleable digestate coming out of the bottom of the digesters, so that we can sell it to the public. And then the other purpose is the pressure lyses the cells and makes the organic matter more available for the hungry microbes in the digesters. We get more gas, therefore more electricity and more heat. And we deliberately designed the system to have turbines, which don't produce as much electricity as an internal combustion engine, but we knew that we would get more energy out of it, and we wanted to generate the heat required to heat up the thermal hydrolysis process. We have to heat up the solids to 160 degrees centigrade, not Fahrenheit, but centigrade, and then hold them in batches for 22 minutes. So it's well above pasteurization. And had we put in an internal combustion engine, we would have had to have a boiler burning natural gas in order to generate enough energy to heat that up. So we felt like this was the most energy efficient system, and we're incredibly proud of it. Our heat recs are recognized in DC. I don't know if that matters to this commission or not, but there is a precedent for this type of recognition. That's the background. I could talk for about 3 hours on this system. I'm so proud of it. I think I'd like to hand it back over to Gregory for the legal argument, if that's all right, unless you have some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Piat. We'll hear your entire presentation, and then the commissioners may have questions.
Thank you, Mr. Piat. Staff have recommended that the commission reject our application, and even this morning to be able to say it's in violation of, and I've lost video. Okay, well, I'm still here. To reject our application and even to say that it's in violation of the statute for the to certify the bioenergy facility for the heat thermal energy generated by the facility from methane biogas. They argue that to determine the eligibility for the facility to qualify for Maryland's renewable portfolio standard requires an interpretation of what constitutes a Tier 1 renewable resource under PUA 7-701R. We agree with the commission staff that the commission relies on the court's explanation of the standards for interpreting a statute, stating, our ultimate objective of statutory interpretation is to ascertain and effectuate the real and actual intent of the legislature. To do so, we must begin with the plain language of the statute. An ordinary popular understanding of the English language dictates interpretation of the law terminology. This plain meaning should be construed to carry out and effectuate or aid in the general purpose of the statute being interpreted. Further, in interpreting a law, a tribunal may not surmise a legislative intention contrary to the plain language of the statute, nor insert or omit words to make the statute express an intention not evidenced in the law original form. A tribunal cannot add or delete language so as to reflect intent not evidenced in the plain and unambiguous language of the statute. Also, a tribunal should not construe a statute with force or subtle interpretations that limit or extend the law's application. We would also add that if the plain and language of the statute is clear and unambiguous, that is the end of the inquiry. In many ways, I think our application presents what may be a new venture applied to the statute in its original form, the original form of the statute when it was enacted in 2004. The question here is, how is that to be interpreted? Maybe this is a question of first review for the commission, and maybe for others that may not have looked at it from the perspectives that we will present today. But I hope the commission will have an open mind in its view of the our presentation. But where we differ with the commission's, differ with the commission staff is how they apply the statutory interpretation. Interpretation standard to the term energy, and how that interpretation applies to our application. Consequently, we do not agree with a conclusion in their statement here today that it's in violation that a Tier 1 renewable source REC applies only to electric generation by the renewable energy facility, or that the Maryland Assembly established exemptions for non-electric energy, which in our reading, they established various classes of renewable sources within the scope of their design, the original design of the RPS. In fact, in our view, no statutory interpretation is required beyond the plain language of the applicable statutes and regulations. And in such view, energy, whether it's in the form of electricity or heat, qualifies for RECs when it's derived from methane biogas. The Maryland Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard states that energy from a Tier 1 renewable source is eligible for inclusion. In meeting the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Pursuant to PUA, or PUC, as some may refer to it, 7-701R4, methane is defined as a Tier 1 renewable source. However, the term energy is not defined in the RPS. The Commission staff would have us look not at the plain meaning of that term, as the statutory interpretation standard would direct, but to look elsewhere to define what the legislature intended that term to mean. As the court provided in Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission versus State Department of Assessment and Taxation, when a term is undefined, the proper interpretation is to use the ordinary and natural meaning. The current edition of the Merriam-Webster's Dictionary defines energy as a usable power, such as heat or electricity. This is the ordinary and natural meaning of the term energy. And throughout the statute, the legislature has applied that particular term in that way, in different ways, to apply to different systems and different sources. And in some cases, may not have spoken at all as to how it should be applied, but left it open. The Maryland Assembly did not permit all the eligible Tier 1 renewable sources to be applied to energy in the form of only electricity, but established limitations on some, but not others, that apply them to heat or electricity, or did not place limitations on how it would be applied. For example, hydropower has a limitation placed on the maximum size and must be generated as electricity. Thermal biomass must be used to generate thermal energy. Solar water heating and geothermal have lengthy requirements, and solar and geothermal poultry, litter to energy, waste to energy, and refuse-derived fuels must be connected to the electric distribution grid serving Maryland. Finally, for methane, to qualify as a Tier 1 renewable source, the Maryland Assembly defines what it's derived from, organic material, how it's processed, anaerobic decomposition, and the type of facility that may process it, landfill or wastewater treatment plant. The Maryland Assembly, however, did not limit what type of energy methane may be used to generate electricity or heat to qualify for RECs. Yes. Sorry. Further, since some Tier 1 eligible renewable sources cannot generate electricity or are restricted to a non-electric use, the RPS explicitly recognizes that energy may be generated in another form. For example, a renewable energy credit is defined as equal to the generation attributes of 1 megawatt of electricity. That is crucially the generation attributes, not the actual generation of 1 megawatt of electricity. If it is a question of how to account for the heat generated from methane biogas to convert it to megawatts per hour, DC Water has provided its metering and reporting methodology in attachment 5 of our application to convert BTUs generated to megawatts per hour. At various points, the RPS refers to energy in a general way. In each case, including the eligibility provision cited above, the statute uses the term energy and not electricity. Examples include PUC or PUA 7-702A1, benefits of renewable energy sources, PUA 7-704A2I, energy from a Tier 1 renewable renewable source under 7-701 R1, 5, 9, 10, and 11, and energy from a Tier 1 renewable source under 7-701 R8 of the subtitle is eligible, even if the system or facility that is capable of generating electricity does not exist. And PUC 7-704C, energy derived from wind. At other points, the RPS refers to a specific form of energy. When it does so, that type is explicitly named. Examples include PUC 7-701D, a system that exchanges thermal energy. PUC 7-701M, a system that uses primarily animal manure to generate thermal energy. PUC 7-701K, a wind turbine electricity generation facility. And PUC 7-701R7, a fuel cell that produces electricity. In addition to the RPS, COMAR 206102 provides regulations governing the application process for certification as a Tier 1 renewable source. Requirements include that the applicant must document that the facility meets the resource eligibility requirements for Tier 1 renewable source or Tier 2 renewable source. As cited above, those criteria in the RPS list various sources which may be used to generate electricity, thermal energy, or other types. The regulations explicitly acknowledge that a renewable generator may be generating electricity. The renewable energy facility may record metered electricity generation or its equivalent for the purpose of receiving a Maryland eligible REC. In the 16 years since the Maryland Assembly enacted the Renewable Energy Statute, they and the Commission have recognized the benefits of using renewable energy sources and to create the renewable portfolio standard to do so. The DC Water Bailey Bioenergy Facility uses methane and biogas as a renewable resource to generate energy in two forms: electricity and heat that can produce steam. In the context of the operation of Blue Plains, both forms supply energy that would otherwise likely be generated from a fossil source. Other than the form of energy it generates, there is no disagreement that the Bailey facility meets all requirements for Tier 1 eligibility. The language included in the legislature and the RPS is plain and clear, listing when sources of energy are eligible and what restrictions apply. A general restriction that energy is generated in the form of electricity is absent, and numerous points in the statute would contradict such a restriction. Moreover, the legislature did not intend to include such a restriction, then omit it accidentally. Instead, the legislature intended to recognize the production of various forms of energy from renewable sources. In 2017, the Commission approved DC Water's Bailey Bioenergy Facility as a Tier 1 renewable energy facility for its use of methane biogas to generate electricity. Therefore, it is not the source that is of issue, but what is generated by that renewable source, heat that produces steam. In 2018, the Public Service Commission for the District of Columbia granted DC Water application for certification for the heat generated from methane. Since the methane that generates the heat at the Bailey facility also meets the definition of eligible sources under the Maryland Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard, and no written restriction limits applicability of the RPS to only one type of energy generated, electricity only, we respectfully request the Commission grant Water's application for certification for the Bailey Bioenergy Facility as a renewable energy facility for the Maryland Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard for the generation of heat.
Thank you, Mr. Hope. Does that conclude DC Water's oral argument?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. It's obviously, it's plainly obvious to me that you spent a lot of time looking at the statutory construction between the RPS language and the REC language of the Public Utilities article. And I agree with you what you said a few minutes ago, that this is a question of first review for this commission. However, when I'm taking a look at 7-701 and looking at all of the various exceptions, in light of what that 2014 task force looked at, the legislature understands what a wastewater treatment facility is, and we have this whole long list, some of which you cited in 7701, such as fuel cells, wind, poultry, litter to energy, byproducts. However, despite the fact that I would argue that RPS statute is more general, the REC provisions are much more specific, and they go ahead and detail line by line what's in and what's out. And when they say what's in, we have a long alphabet of exceptions here. I don't see waste heat and biogas produced by a wastewater treatment facility within them. So it's a relatively simple question for me whether you believe this commission has the authority to reach outside of that scope and construct that interpretation. And I see Mr. Piat has, so perhaps we could let him respond, or Mr. Hope.
If you don't mind, I would like to just add one comment. The fact that there are exceptions listed, I would think doesn't necessarily mean that those are the only exceptions and that there could potentially be more. I just want to point out that the thermal hydrolysis system that we have at Blue Plains prior to digestion is the first of its kind in North America. So it's quite possible that this type of energy demand for digestion was never considered.
And I agree with you there. I think Mr. Hope referred to this as a quote unquote new venture, and I believe that's quite possible. These statutes are a snapshot in time, and they need to be revised from time to time. And this statute has been revised almost every legislative session to either add or remove different forms of energy. Now, can you just tell me what type of RECs does DC Water currently receive, not only from Maryland, but from other jurisdictions? Do you receive it for methane?
We generate electricity RECs that are recognized in DC, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. We just recently gained our registration in Pennsylvania. And then we also are generating the steam RECs that are recognized in DC. And then we also have specific language in the DC RPS that allows for RECs to be generated from heating and cooling with wastewater. So we have some buildings in DC that are that use recovered heat from the sewer heat recovery to heat the buildings in the winter and cool them in the summer. And we were receiving RECs for that, as well as under that same language in DC again, we are using wastewater to cool the solids between Canby and the digester, the thermal hydrolysis and the digesters, and we are receiving RECs in DC for those. Those are all thermal RECs. And
that's the concern for me. The Maryland statute doesn't have clarity on this this resource as of yet, and I agree entirely with the staff comments. What Mr. Albert stated from the very beginning, that this is a very efficient process. You're commended to have this process in place, and it's my hope that the statute would catch up with this type of new process. But as a commissioner, I'm concerned that I can't read the construction that Mr. Hope is reading between the RPS language, which I recognize is general and states energy, with a much more narrow REC language. So let me leave it at there. Yes, Mr. Hope.
The only thing I would say is that there are many limitations on various other sources, but there are no limitations on this particular source. When I look at the number of RECs or REC facilities for landfill for methane, I think there are only about 10 so far. And this is since 2006 when it was first, I guess, started. Legislation is 2004. I think it went into effect in 2006. It's only 10 in the whole state or the RPJ. So I would think that even if there is, in terms of the methods by which it can be accounted for, I think the staff and DC Water can work together on what that could be, what's something that is acceptable.
And I recognize that there are no limitations, but there's no reference either with respect to this resource. And if the commission rejects your application today, nothing changes to your process at DC Water. Is that correct? You just don't receive the stream of revenue.
Right, we started the process in 2015. It'll continue thereon. I think in terms of its benefits to the Maryland RPS system, that will be the only impact, to the extent that Maryland's moving from the 5% to a 50%. This may well assist in those facilities, electric facilities, meeting those particular requirements.
I appreciate that. That's an important priority and a policy goal of the state to meet its RPS goal. At this time, I'm going to turn to my fellow commissioners to see if they have any questions. And I'll start with Commissioner O'Donnell, who we can't see today because of some connection issues. But Commissioner O'Donnell, I can't see your display on my platform. Do you have any questions for DC Water?
I do, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate it. I hope you can hear me, and I apologize for my lack of connectivity. It's a bandwidth issue, and so I apologize to those who are viewing and can't see me.
And Commissioner, you're just fine.
Okay, thank you. Although some may consider that a benefit, they couldn't see me, Mr. Chairman. So, but Mr. Hope, I wanted to ask you, if memory serves me correctly, and I don't believe you and I know each other, but I served in the Maryland legislature for the better part of 22 years. If memory serves me correctly, Blue Plains services Montgomery County and Prince George's County. Is that right?
Yes, that's true.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
In fact, where I live right now, my wastewater goes to Blue Plains. I live in Silver Spring, Maryland.
And has DC Water made any move? I mean, the Maryland Commission approved your electricity generation for RECs in 2017. Your current process from an engineering perspective has been in place since 2015. And I have to tell you, the Carnot efficiency of that process is exciting to me from a steam plant technician in the nuclear world. It's very efficient. I get it. It's a good thing. But have you tried through the legislature? Have you made any attempts through the Maryland legislature to have the statute amended?
Mr. Piott may be aware of that.
Not for this particular issue. We wanted to bring it before the commission before we took those steps.
Yeah, I would suggest if the commission is inclined to, if when we get to a decision, if we're inclined to not approve your application, I would think that the combined weight of the Prince George's County delegation and the Montgomery County delegation in both the Maryland House of Delegates and the Maryland Senate are very substantial. They're combined, they're the two largest delegations in the state, and they would carry substantial weight on an issue like this. And I would think that if there isn't clarity in the statute, that would be the way to go, and it could probably, I'm guessing, having served in the legislature for almost 22 years, that it would move pretty quickly through that legislative process. So if we are to agree with staff today, and I don't know that we will or not, but I would be inclined to say that's probably your best avenue of success.
Understood. I would think, as the commissioner had asked originally, does the commission have the authority? I think we're only asking to apply the law as it reads. There is a lot within the RECs part of it that may speak to other limitations, but in 704, that's the provision that we are focusing on that gives the commission the authority to be able to act in this way. Time has changed, processes have changed, but the language is as it was back in 2004, leaving it open to how it would be applied in the future.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Do we have other questions from commissioners?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Hope, I'm a little bit, I have a couple questions about your legal argument. You're saying that we should go back to an earlier statute and look at that statute as opposed to Lorm? Is that your argument?
No, actually, what I'm saying is the statute with respect to this particular provision dealing with methane from wastewater treatment as a renewable source was part of the original structure. It was the original structure back in 2004. It hasn't changed since. And so it's that structure that exists today that I'm looking for the commissioners to basis for the decision.
Okay, and so, but you do already receive RECs in Maryland for the electricity produced from the methane, right?
That's correct.
Okay. You know, I think I'm in. I have the same concerns that the chairman has. I fully support what DC Water is doing, and I think it's great. But I think that our statute is very specific, and so my concerns are that we're going beyond the clear meaning of the statute. And to the extent the commission does, feel it compelled to deny this application, it certainly would be without prejudice to coming back later and trying to get the statute changed, trying to get the law changed to incorporate this, because I think it's a great process. But I'm having similar concerns with the chairman on our ability to approve these RECs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr.
Commissioner Richard.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, I think a couple of questions you already answered, but as far as the RECs that are produced, you said that DC is accepting those now. It is tier 1, and it is, the process is accepted by DC for inclusion in their RPS program. Is that correct? Did I hear that right?
Yes, that is the case.
Okay. And I think you also said this was like a first of a kind in North America, even process. How long is your wastewater facility the first to use it, to have adopted it?
It is. Digestion is very common, of course, but we put the thermal hydrolysis ahead of the digesters. It's sort of a supercharger. High heat, high pressure kills the pathogens, and then we get more gas production out of it. There's a whole bunch of reasons we did it, but it's a Norwegian technology. It's all over Europe, and we vetted it. We took a couple trips over there and we vetted it, and I'm very proud of our board for allowing us to put this new technology in. New to the US, new to North America, but not new to the world. Just to note, there are half a dozen more since we put it in 2015 who are planning construction since they came to look at ours and they heard the success of what we're doing. So there's one in Virginia, one in Maryland, a couple in Texas, California.
Okay. We know these are a couple cases here. The legislature has recognized thermal processes. Can you just help me a little bit with, in number 13 on the list, in the tier 1 list, is thermal energy from a thermal biomass system. When I was just trying to understand more about that process, one of the processes used is anaerobic digestion. Is that your understanding as well for number 13? Is that correct, that even though it's a different source material, it's either animal or plant, it is a similar anaerobic digestion, and there are multiple processes used, it looks like, for thermal energy.
Yeah, I might be able to clarify the difference between R4 and R12. In R12, the thermal biomass is fairly tightly defined, and it refers primarily to animal manure and associated bedding as the feedstock for the digestion. So while the digestion process is similar, what you put into the digester is different. So that the fundamental difference then between R4 and R12 is what goes into the front end of the digester, not what comes out the back end of it. So in the case of R4, what's going into the front end of the digester is wastewater solids. So the byproduct of wastewater treatment coming out of a sewer, primarily human waste. In the case of R12, it's a digester that's being fed mostly with either animal waste or food waste. And, you know, there isn't necessarily a technical reason why those need to be treated differently, but the legislature chose to write the statute in that way such that they are classified differently under the RPS. And notably, under R12, it's limited to thermal uses, whereas in R4, it simply lists the methane as the eligible source.
Okay. I guess I was just trying to ascertain whether what you're doing is possibly could be considered a subset of the thermal energy from a thermal biomass system, given that some of those systems do use an anaerobic digestion process.
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, if that were the case, then we would have happily applied under that one. For two reasons, it's precluded. First of all, is as I just said, the source is not listed. So human waste, wastewater, sewage, none of those are listed as eligible items under the thermal biomass. The other reason that precludes us is that the R12 is limited only to systems located within the state of Maryland itself, whereas most are limited to the PJM region at large. And since our system is within the boundaries of the District of Columbia, we of course wouldn't qualify given the geographic limitation for R12. Again, R4, the one that is specifically describing wastewater treatment plant digestion, wastewater treatment methane, does not have a parallel only within the boundaries of the state of Maryland restriction.
Okay, so it's the boundary issue, but the process otherwise would be the same.
Feedstock is also crucial, right? If you look at the thermal biomass definition in the statute, it states that it's a system that uses primarily animal manure and food waste or qualifying biomass for the remainder. Our system doesn't use any animal manure. We could stretch the definition that humans are animals, but in my opinion, it would be a stretch. Animal manure and wastewater solids are not the same thing. They can be processed in a similar manner, but you know, the way thermal biomass is currently defined, our system does not qualify.
Okay. All right. I think those answer to my questions. Yeah, I'm kind of in the similar dilemma as the chairman and Commissioner O'Donnell and Herman. However, I think in this case, I would fall more in the side. I think the legislature has spoken that they support thermal processes. They clearly support methane from wastewater plants, and this definitely is a very novel and interesting process that I took your argument that it would be good to incentivize, motivate other systems, other wastewater systems to apply this system in their operations. So I think there's a strong public interest argument, and I still feel it's within the bounds of what the legislature intends to come out of the RPS. It replaces a fossil fuel, and you know, definitely we hear from them. We sometimes have, as a commission, you know, gone astray, and they've come back and let us know right away. I have no doubt that would be the case in here if you know, we approve this. But I think the trend is more that this would be approved once they understand the process, and so yeah, I think I lean in favor of accepting this application. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Richard. Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. I had a few questions, but it almost seems like I'm kind of torn about the concept of what actually is happening here, because on one side, I greatly appreciate what the applicant is doing here with regard to this steam generation, the biogas generation. But at the same time, when I look at the General Assembly's intent, which is stated in 7702 of the 219 law, I mean, it's pretty clear what they're, at least to me, that the intention of this was to attempt to establish a market for electricity. So I guess for the applicant, help me to understand how this particular component where you're producing biogas, how is that helping the commission establish a market for electricity with regard to not only basically to help lower the cost of electricity, how does it help to decrease emissions for generating electricity? My understanding from your filing, this is your supplemental filing, on page 4, you stated that when developing this particular component of the wastewater treatment plant, you had an option between natural gas, biogas. So you weren't looking at using electricity. So help me to understand how this helps from an emissions perspective, as the General Assembly stated in the statute. How does this help us build an electricity market, lower the need for generating electricity from what we might refer to as dirty generating plants, et cetera?
Yeah, I don't think that it specifically helps with the generation of electricity, but if the intent was to reduce emissions from the production of electricity, this also reduces emissions because we are not burning an enormous amount of natural gas. And emissions are emissions. We prefer not to do that. And again, I'm not sure exactly what the intent of that language was, but if it was to reduce emissions, we are definitely doing that.
And to expand on Chris' comments, it's worth noting that while the market for electricity is called out in 7702, when the renewable resources are called out, they're identified as renewable energy resources. And the inclusion of a number of thermal resources in the explicit thermal resources in the RPS suggests that the legislature recognizes that energy is fundamentally linked and that a source of energy can be used to produce different types. So natural gas, for example, can be used to produce either heat or electricity or even mechanical power in the sense of a natural gas vehicle, for example. The markets for all of these products are linked, and of course the atmosphere that receives the emissions from any of the burned fuels is the same atmosphere. So in that sense, by avoiding the burning of natural gas, we avoid both the emissions from what we would have burned, as well as the purchase, which would have a secondary impact on the electricity market for the state. We could have tried to generate this much heat with electricity. The efficiencies would have been ridiculously bad, and you know it wasn't even worth contemplating from a design perspective. So it would of course be theoretically possible. I think on the simplest answer to the question is that at the end of the day, you know, there is a single market for energy in which we all participate, and you know, though we are not having an immediate impact on the electricity market. That is true of any source that primarily generates thermal energy, many of which are recognized and have been approved, or certified rather, by this commission in previous applications. So, you know, we believe that there is recognition that the use of renewable thermal sources has benefits within the electricity market, as well as within the broader atmosphere that receives emissions.
If I could also add, I think there's an idea that the language in 702 doesn't express the intent, but I think what we're trying to also focus on is the particular statutes which have their own interpretation as they're written. I think if we only apply the intent that's in 702 to give meaning to all the other terms, that's not necessarily the process that the commission has gone through before. So if the term, I do focus back on the term energy, and I think that's 701, and how that's actually applied. What does that word actually mean? You wouldn't necessarily go to 702 in order to give meaning to the word energy in and of itself. You would try to understand what the legislator intended by using that broad term. I think there are other provisions that come after it that talk about electricity thereafter. I can just reference just one small thing. If I have it, if I don't, maybe it's in 704. where the legislature basically goes on to say, well, energy form of this is eligible for RECs. Energy and these other things are only allowed if they are producing electricity. So the general form of this is wonderful. Working out of a room, seems to give great weight to being able to apply it differently. This is actually 704. So 704A speaks about energy in general, but when you A1 talks about energy in general, but then when you go with 704A2, energy from tier 1 sources connected with the electric distribution grid. And 3, energy from renewable source from 701R8 that is capable of generating electricity. These other things have certain applications to them that with respect to 701, our renewable source, there is no limitation in 704A1. If I made any sense in doing that, I hope I did. If you have any, please ask.
No, I certainly follow, and I appreciate the argument. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Linton. Mr. Kinter, we neglected to take your appearance on the record. Can you just state your name and affiliation?
Certainly. My name is Paul Kinter. I am the Energy Initiatives Program Manager for DC Water.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, you've heard from 5 commissioners, 5 different perspectives. I think you've also heard some recommendations along the way. At this time, we'll take a vote. But I propose that we deny DC Water's request that the commission certify the Blue Plains plant as a renewable energy facility in connection with the thermal energy produced by the plant. The vote begins with Commissioner Richard.
As I said, I support the application, so I guess I would be voting in opposition to the motion. Just want to make that clear. I'm not voting no.
As a no, Commissioner O'Donnell.
Aye.
Commissioner Linton.
Aye.
Commissioner Herman.
Aye.
I also vote aye. So by a vote of 4-1, the motion is approved to deny the request. Thank you to Water. Mr. Secretary.
Mr. Chairman, item number 4 on today's administrative agenda is a request for the Potomac Edison Company for approval of a special lighting contract relating to lights for the parking lot at the Westview Promenade in Frederick, Maryland. For staff on this item, we have Anna Joy Thompson, David Hoppick, and Michael Dean. And for the company, Jeffrey Trout, Raymond Valdez, Wayne Rummel, and Christopher Hickson.
Thank you. Good morning, staff.
Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. Anna Joy Thompson on behalf of staff. On March 11th, 2020, Potomac Edison filed a request for approval of a special lighting contract relating to lights for the parking lot at the Westview Promenade with Hill Management Services in Frederick, Maryland. Under this contract, PE will replace the existing metal halide lights at the premises with a type of LED fixture which is not presently offered in PE's tariff for an initial term of 15 years. The special contract was signed by Hill Management Services on March 9th by PE on March 10th, 2020. After reviewing how the rates in the contract were determined, staff discovered the rates do not account for the depreciation and removal expenses associated with the existing lights that have not yet been recovered through the existing rates. Staff estimates that this, along with long-term service discount, will result in a revenue shortfall of $67,823.95 over the life of the contract. As explained in staff's comments, Public Utilities Article 4-101 defines a just and reasonable rate as a rate that will allow the utility to earn a reasonable return after deducting for reasonable depreciation and expenses. This special contract does not account for reasonable depreciation, and the rates are set below what is needed for PE to earn its rate of return. This may result in the contract passing on costs to other customers. Additionally, staff has concerns that the cost of premature failure of the LED lights will be passed on to other customers as well. Staff recommends that the Commission reject the special contract without prejudice, as it does not meet the just and reasonable standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. I don't believe we have anybody here from Hill Management Service. So we will move to the utility.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. This is Jeffrey Trout. I'm counsel to Potomac Edison. First of all, can you hear me?
I hear you just fine.
Great, thank you very much. The company does not disagree with certain aspects of the staff's analysis, and in particular with their recommendation that if the commission chooses to reject this contract, they do so without prejudice. But we approached this matter from a different perspective than staff did, and I believe that explains why we are arguing for a different conclusion than the one that staff is arguing for. We had the customer who very much wants to replace their lights, their existing fixtures with LEDs. And we support that for all the reasons that we laid out in our application for approval. The customer is seeking a particular kind of fixture that's not covered by the existing tariff, but in all other respects, they are situated the same as any other existing customer under the tariff or any other customer that would apply today or tomorrow to install one of the fixtures that is covered by the existing tariff. So in light of those facts, the approach we took was to try to put this customer in the same position as any other customer would be, and to try to replicate as closely as possible for this customer the terms of the existing tariff. And finally, as a part of the special contract, we made it explicit and clear that to the extent the tariff changes in the future, the service would be from that future date consistent with the changed tariff, and to the extent that there was any difference between the terms of the contract and the new change tariff, the new change tariff would control. So again, we were trying, and that would be the situation of any customer that was covered by the tariff already. So again, in that respect, as with all the others, we were trying to treat this customer the same as all of our existing customers and all of the customers that would approach us in the future under the current terms of the tariff and ask to be served under the current terms of the tariff. So the result of that is that the three changes, in effect, that staff contends should be made to the contract were not made. An existing customer would get the benefit of the long-term contract discount, the 50-cent discount. So that's why that's included as part of our proposed service to this customer. An existing customer would not, if they changed to LEDs, would not be paying stranded costs on the fixtures being replaced. And so that is why that is not included in the terms of this contract. And finally, the provision about paying repair costs, which staff found in a PEPCO tariff, and which they suggest should be applied to our customer, is not something that is currently in our tariff. It's in PEPCO's tariff, but it's not in our tariff. And so if we were to seek to add such a term to the special contract, we would be putting this customer in a different position from every other customer currently being served by the existing tariff. So staff's approach was to look at the risks associated with future cost recovery, and we don't argue with the analysis staff conducted. Indeed, it was a sound analysis. And our approach was to try to put this customer on as fair and even a playing field as all of our other customers. And I don't understand staff to have questioned how we did that. So it's the issue before the commission is there are two ways of looking at serving this customer, and which way should the commission authorize or direct the company to proceed? That's the issue. It's not. I'll go out on a limb here and I'll say it's not a choice between something that's right and something that's wrong. It's a choice between two different attempts to arrive at the right result by two different means, and which the commission judges to be better.
Thank you, Mr. Trout. You make a number of compelling arguments in this case, and similar to the case that preceded this one. I think it is beneficial to remove all these lights, even though they haven't been fully depreciated before their life expectancy has come to an end, and swap them out for LEDs. It looks like it would save the customer several $1,000s per month over the next 15 years. As I understand from Ms. Thompson and staff's buck sheet, their primary concern is that the possibility that other ratepayers would be picking up the tab for this some odd $67,000, which is relatively small in the whole scheme of things. Is it your argument that these costs would not be borne by others, or does that possibility exist?
I would agree that if nothing changed over the next 15 years, that possibility would exist in whole or in part. Obviously, staff having raised these concerns and raised these issues, the company is in a position to address them the next time we revise the LED tariff, which would occur, one would expect it to occur no later than the rate case that the commission has already directed us to file within now less than 3 years. So the likelihood of there being a significant problem, I would contend, is small. And to the extent that the commission directed us to act in the future on staff's recommendations with respect to the tariff more generally, that likelihood further diminishes.
Just so that I'm clear, you're saying that the likelihood that there would be any risk exposure to your other ratepayers within the next 3 years would be limited to none. Is that what I heard?
I believe that's correct. The $67,000 figure I understood, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but that was sort of the worst case scenario if the contract terms continue to apply and one achieved a failure rate that was consistent with staff's projections and the like. So that's sort of the worst case scenario.
And you said worst case scenario. I'm gonna ask staff that question in a minute, so if staff could get ready, whether 67,800 is the worst case scenario over a course of 15 years. I had one more question for you, Mr. Trout, but it's escaped me.
Perhaps
staff,
whether we would, perhaps whether it was we were going to, would we include the savings with respect to swapping out these lights in our Empower results, and therefore there would be a benefit to the state in terms of achieving our Empower goals if we're able to proceed with this. And the answer to that question is yes, we would seek to do that. So there is a collateral benefit that isn't monetized, but that would flow from approving this contract.
That wasn't my question, but you got a plug in there for the benefit. Let me go back to staff and staff council. Since the utility is required to come back in within 3 years, I think it was by 2023 with their next rate case, is there a substantial risk that ratepayers between now and then, if these new LEDs are installed, would be exposed to picking up any portion of this $67,000?
So first I can explain the $67,000, and then I do have Mr. Hoppick online as well if he wants to answer further beyond what I say. So $67,823 came from the existing lights that are in place. They had a 31-year life, but they have only been in place since I believe around 2002. I can double check that number if you want. But because they were removed early, the full depreciation amount was not fully recovered through their rates, as well as the cost of removal. And so that, along with the 50-cent discount that's put on each light per month, accumulated is where we get the $67,000.
Ms. Thompson, could I stop you there on the 50-cent discount per light per month? Is that something that's standard? Is that permissible? Should that be included in the 67,000 sum?
That is in their tariff for their lighting customers. However, if you look at it simply from they need to have the opportunity to earn the rate of return, if you take the proper rate in order to get that rate of return and then subtract 50 cents from it, then you will then be below the approved revenue requirement.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll have Mr. Trout respond to that point, but I didn't want to interrupt you.
That's fine. I can turn it over to Mr. Hoppick now.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Ms. Thompson, I think, did a good job of describing how we came up with the approximately $68,000. So the 50-cent discount per month, the shorter amount of time that is in the rate under the special contract, the lower amount the under recovery would be for that. For the depreciation, unrecovered depreciation and unrecovered removal costs, if those are put into the contract now, the reason we have those unrecovered depreciation and removal costs is because we're removing the existing lights early, which do include benefits in terms of reduced energy use, but that is the cause for those costs. So if those were included now in rates, then just the West Hill Promenade rates would recover that cost. If those were recovered in the next rate case, it's likely those costs would be spread across either all lighting customers, if the class is over earning or approximately, has a UROR of 1, or all customers if it's under earning.
Thank you, Mr. Hoppick. Mr. Trout, would you like to respond to any of that?
Subject to check with Mr. Valdez. I agree with staff's analysis. I don't think there was anything in what Ms. Thompson or Mr. Hoppick said now, or for that matter in staff's bug sheet, that we believed was incorrect. It's just that we're approaching this from the angle of trying to treat the customer the same as existing customers under the tariff.
Yes, good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. This is Ray Valdez from Potomac Edison. I'm sympathetic to staff's comments. I understand where they're coming from. The overarching decision for us filing it, the basis that we have was to treat them the same as other scheduled LED customers in the tariff. And since the 50-cent provision is within that tariff right now, and it doesn't collect stranded costs for customers that switch from one lighting option to another, we wanted to treat this customer the same as if they had been billed under scheduled LED. But that being said, I am sympathetic to what the staff is saying, and I understand their concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Valdez. I'll open it up to my fellow commissioners at this time. I'll start with Commissioner Herman.
Thank you. Mr. Trout, or Mr. Valdez, is there anything that prohibits PE? I can't recall anything that would prohibit PE from just revising this tariff and making these kinds of lights available to other customers as well. I'm trying to think of whether we prohibited that, but I can't recall.
I am not aware of any such prohibition, Commissioner. Revising the LED tariff, something that in light of recent technological developments, as well as policy developments, is something that needs to be done. It is a lot more complex than just addressing the needs of this one particular customer. And frankly, we do not want to hold up making this change for this customer to wait on a broader revision of the LED street lighting tariff. But you're absolutely right that we could, in the future, submit a revised tariff to the commission for consideration. I would anticipate that we would do so in the upcoming general rate case. But if there were a need to do that beforehand, it would require a fair amount of work. And as I said, consideration of the need of many customers other than just this one customer, that there's no impediment to doing that other than doing the work of figuring out how it should be revised.
So if within the next 3 years before, until you file your next rate case, another customer comes with another product that they want to install, then you would theoretically have another special contract for that customer?
It would depend on the facts and circumstances. If what the customer was asking for was a product that was one of general applicability, that more customers than just one might want, then that would be, in my mind, a very good argument for proposing a broader revision of the tariff. We thought this was a one-off in terms of this technology and this customer, and frankly, we were looking for the path of earliest reasonable implementation on this. But that would not necessarily be the case the next time a customer approaches us about this issue.
Okay. And Mr. Hoppick and Ms. Johnson, do you agree with PE that their approach has put the customer and all other customers in the same position as they would be if it had been a tariff revision?
So this is David Hoppick. I think in part, the rates that are set for street lighting and private area lighting in a rate case include the costs in the cost of service study of things like early failure, early removal, and such that go into that class's unitized rate of return. So, in the last rate case, I did look at the street lighting class, I believe, and we had multiple cost of service studies. They all had it at about a unitized rate of return of 1.7. And so, that UROR is then used to decide how much of the revenue requirement is allocated to that class. So, there may not be a specific provision in the terms of the lighting tariffs that specifically state that, if you have a light that fails early, you have to pay to replace it. But in setting the revenue requirement to come up with the rates for that class, those costs, I would argue, are included. Whereas in this instance, we're kind of with a clean slate. And we have a new set of lights that are not in the tariff, obviously, and we're trying to figure out what the correct cost to the customer should be for those lights.
So was that a yes or a no?
I guess in terms of like line items in the tariff, I would say they're treating them approximately the same, but in terms of how we actually come up with rates, I would say no.
Okay.
Two-part answer, I guess.
And do you, is this something that if the commission were to approve PE's request today, that if there were unrecovered depreciation and cost of removal, if that did happen, that could be a potentially, or would that be addressed, and could that be addressed in their next rate case?
I think it could be. I think it's the main issue is who would pay for it. So if you're going to create for these specific types of lights a tariff that's open to everybody, then presumably you would not necessarily want to put the costs for unrecovered depreciation and removal of these specific lights into those rates, right? Because then someone else could use it, but they'd be paying for West Hill Promenade's costs. Whereas if we do it in the special contract, then the thing that caused the cost is paying for the costs.
Right. But we could address it in the next rate case. Could be addressed.
I think we could potentially address it, but again, I think how we would address it is we would socialize the costs, whereas in this instance, we would put it on West Hill Promenade.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Hoppick, Mr. Trout. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner. If I could just follow up and jump in at that point. Mr. Trout, has there been any discussion of having Hill Management bear any of these costs that staff laid out in the buck sheet? Obviously amortized over 15 years. It's not a tremendous amount. I recognize staff takes a principled approach, whether it be a penny or $1 million. Their analysis is not very forgiving, where you're attempting to come in with more of a sort of a, lack of a better word, a common sense approach here. Has there been any discussions that you could share on that count?
We have not, since staff brought their concerns to our attention, we have not approached the customer to, for example, see if they wanted to renegotiate the contract. And that was because we have an agreement with the customer, and we believed that it is our obligation to present that agreement to the commission and to defend that agreement in front of the commission, as we have done today.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Trout. Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. I had a question for Potomac Edison. Help me to understand how unique Westview is. Are they the only customer that's in this situation, or are there other customers that are receiving have a similar situation like theirs?
This customer is asking for a lighting product that, so far as we have been able to determine, not only has no other Potomac Edison customer asked for, but no other customer of any of the 10 First Energy utilities has asked for. So in that respect, they are, to our knowledge, unique. Was that the thrust of your question, Commissioner?
Well, no, I'm looking at page 1 of your comments where you talk about your concern regarding the ability to replace these fixtures when they're damaged. Are there other customers that are also using the same lighting equipment as West Hill?
There are customers that have switched to LEDs that are covered by our existing tariff, and there are other customers that could do that. And then if we revise the tariff in the future during or before the next case, and we offered more lighting options in the tariff, customers would be able to do that. So there are other customers that have wanted to switch to LEDs, but we've been able to accommodate those customers. We are aware of other customers that may want to switch to products other than what's covered by the tariff and other than what this customer is asking for. And that is part of why we are trying to figure out how this tariff should be rewritten, which process staff has helped us with in their analysis in this case.
Okay. All right. That was my only question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Chairman, and again, I apologize to those viewing for not being video capable today. Mr. Trout, I wanted to follow up on the chairman's question to you. So if the commission were to follow the recommendation of staff, how will you proceed? What will you do with this customer? What will you do with this proposal? What will you do with the agreement you've negotiated with the customer? Where do you?
Well, the agreement is contingent on commission approval. So were the commission to disagree with our recommendation and reject the contract but agree with staff and do so without prejudice, we could then, and I would imagine we would, approach the customer and explain the situation to them. And we would be able to, hopefully, based on this hearing and on the commission's decision, be able to point them towards a revised contract that would get commission approval. But that would then be their decision as to whether they wanted a revised contract or not. And I just want to make very clear that the company stands by the existing contract, and that is what we are urging the commission to approve. We have a deal, we stand by our deal, and we're going to defend this deal unless and until the commission decides otherwise.
Understood, and you've advocated very strongly for that on behalf of your customer and the deal that you've struck with them. So no doubt about that. You've been true to your agreement, and I appreciate that. I'm trying to envision what's down the road based on the decision we make here today. So thank you for that answer. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Seeing no additional questions, I found the arguments of the utility to be compelling here. In addition, I do believe that this is an issue that we can address in the next rate case to the extent that there are any concerns or problems. So at this point, I do not support staff's recommendation, and I would approve the contract. I'll call a vote on approving the contract, which is not staff's recommendation, and we'll see how that falls out. So the vote to approve the contract as filed begins with Commissioner Richard.
I agree with everything you said, and I'm going to vote, on the merits of the contract and the request. So I vote yes.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, I'm inclined to support the recommendation of the staff. It's a close call. This is a close issue. Good arguments on both sides, but I'm gonna default to the staff recommendation in this instance, and I think there are other remedies that could be available. So neither side is right or wrong, as Mr. Trout said. So I agree with that too. I vote against the motion.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Linton.
Aye.
Commissioner Herman.
Aye.
And just for the record, I vote aye by a vote of 4-1. The motion is approved. With no additional business before the commission today, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.